Hello and welcome to the Final Frontiersmen. I'm Bill and this is Star Trek Adventures Academy, a rules refresher series where we talk about the rules from Star Trek Adventures role-playing game for anyone coming back to the game after a while or who needs help processing what they've read in the rulebook and maybe needs to hear it in a different way. So this is lesson 5. This is social and personal conflict. This is the combat chapter, not for starships. That will be in the next lesson. As usual, if there's anything I left out, anything major I left out, because I'm not going to cover every single aspect of the rules, this is just a broad overview. If there's anything that you feel needs to be mentioned, please leave a comment below and let's add it to the series. But without further ado, let me get into the small window and let's talk about conflict. So conflict, in general, conflict, whether it's social conflict or personal combat, the flow is normally the GM will determine who is the first character to act, and it's usually the player characters. They will act unless there's a good reason for the NPC to go first, and the order is then determined by each side which character is going to act. There is no set order for initiative. So if the player characters go first, then next will be the enemy side, then player characters, NPC, player, NPC, so on and so forth, unless they pay to keep the initiative as one of the momentum spends. But it generally follows that, and you determine the order you want your characters to go in. If there's any doubt whether an NPC or a player should start first, if there's any debate about this, the GM can spend a point of threat to allow the NPC side to go first, and then we get underway. So, the first type of conflict we are going to discuss is social conflict. So let's take a look at that. Social conflict are all the persuasion, tasks, and challenges that are resolved through the social tools such as diplomacy, deception, bargaining, negotiation, intimidation, and anything of those sorts. If you succeed at one of these persuasion tasks, then you gain whatever it is that you are seeking. Now, some of the persuasion tasks will range, or I should say all of the persuasion tasks will range from the trivial, which you don't even have to roll for. If it's something that the other side is willing to do, or it's not much trouble for them to do, and there's no reason for them to stop the player characters, it should be an automatic success. To a request that entails a little bit of risk from the other party, that should be a task. If it's a great risk or a great danger that you are trying to get the other party to agree to or to perform, that way, of course, maybe be refused, and you might need to negotiate and change things up before it can actually work. And then it goes to impossible requests, which there is no roll again. It's just impossible to do as is. So it runs the whole range there. Don't think that just because your players want to negotiate for something, you have to allow them. If it's impossible, if they're going to Gowron and saying, Gowron, I want you to give me the entire Klingon Empire and make me the king, there's no reason in the universe that he's going to say yes. So look at what they're asking for and look at who they're asking and set the challenge accordingly. If the persuasion task fails, even an auto fail like I described there, the player's characters cannot try again unless they change the circumstances. So if there's a failure, they need to think of another way to sweeten the deal or approach from another direction before they can make another attempt. They cannot just keep rolling and rolling and rolling until it succeeds. So if the first player fails, they're not going to have the next player try and next player try and next player try unless there's a reason why the circumstances are different for the target. Then, and of course, the GM will determine whether any of it's possible or not. So then you utilize your social tools. Your social tools are your means of getting social conflict done. So social tools are deception. Deception is an opposed task. You're lying to the target to get them to do whatever you want them to do. If you succeed, the success will apply a trait to the target that reflects the lie that they now believe. And the difficulty of this task is going to be determined by how believable the lie is that your players are doing. Now, if the target discovers they were being lied to, this may prevent them from trusting the players again, or it may affect how future encounters happen with the player or player characters. And complications rolled during this could be used to show flaws in the lie, flaws in the deception that the players are trying to do. So GM could play with this accordingly to make it very interesting. The next social tool is intimidation. So intimidation is trying to inspire fear, doubt, and any kind of uncertainty in the target. This again would be, of course, an opposed roll. The difficulty would be based on how the threat is perceived by the other party. If the player characters succeed, that will also impose a trait on the target, and the trait would reflect the fear that they feel for being intimidated. And keep in mind, this is an openly hostile social tool, so it's probably going to make the situation, or at least the standing between these characters, worse than it was before, because they're not willingly doing it for players. They're being threatened, more or less, into doing it. And there is negotiation. Negotiation is, of course, each side is providing something in exchange for the other. So, for example, it will create an advantage that represents the favorable offering, and it will create a complication which reflects the cost that the players have to play in order to provide whatever is the target wants in this negotiation. Each new offer would be considered a change of circumstances. So again, if the first offer fails, they can sweeten the deal, and that will allow them to try again. So they have to come with a new offer, a different offer, which again would change the advantage, change the complication. And the task may succeed, of course, because this is negotiating, but the cost might be really high. Your players, if they keep failing, they might have to give far too much than they want to. But that's standard negotiation. One other tool that is part of the social tools aspect would be evidence. And evidence would be offering proof of the claims, whatever they are trying to use in this social conflict. This might make the persuasion task automatically succeed, depending on what the evidence is, or it might make it a lot easier to do. And it can, of course, be used in conjunction with the other social tools like deception, intimidation, negotiation, and what have you. So that is the standard for social conflict. You basically, they're all opposed tasks unless they automatically are succeeding or failing, and you're determining your approach. Are you being genuine? Are you negotiating? Are you being deceptive? Are you being threatening? And the GM will set the difficulty levels for that, and you go accordingly based on however you're trying to do it using these social tools. So social conflict is pretty straightforward. It's a whole variety of tasks that you could apply to it using those abilities there. What's more difficult is, or more complicated, is coming up next, and that's the actual physical combat. That is the personal combat. So let's move into that quickly, and let's start covering that. Personal combat, and let me just say before I get into it, a lot of combat, the main points, the main broad sweeps of combat are very similar to the mechanics for extended tasks. If you watch lesson 4 where we covered extended tasks, or you're already familiar with extended tasks, you pretty much know how combat itself, the nitty-gritty of the mechanics works. And Starship Combat is also going to follow the exact same principle. So the sooner you understand the extended task mechanic, the sooner you're going to get a grasp on all the combat in the game. So combat has ranges, but the main point is it occurs in zones. So zones are pretty abstract because Star Trek Adventures is a very narrative game. Zones are typically defined by terrain and the territory, and there's no fixed size that a zone is like equal to this many meters or this many miles. It's very, very vague, and it's used to be malleable for whatever your combat situation is. So for example, you could say the clearing we are in is one zone, the forest over here is another zone, the mountains in the distance, that's a different zone, and you would establish their ranges based on that description. So the distances, the ranges involved, there's 5 different types. There's reach, which is anything within arm's length, and if there's an enemy within arm's length, then anything that is not a melee task, a melee combat task, is going to have its difficulty increased by 1 because the enemy is right there in your face. You can't really do anything else easily while that combat is going on. That is reach. The next range is close, and close is considered to be the zone that you are in. So again, if we were using that example of you're in the clearing in the woods, that entire clearing is considered close range. And then the forest next to that, that would be medium range. That's the next one. Number 3, medium range is considered 1 zone away. It's the adjacent zone to whatever zone you are occupying. Then there's long range, which would then be 2 zones away, and extreme range, which is 3 or more ranges away from where your character is now. And now you might be thinking, oh, okay, well, a forest is gigantic. How can that be 1 zone when my clearing is only 1 zone? Again, you can break it down into more parts. Once they enter the forest, this section here with the overgrown shrubs or whatever, that's now the close range. That's where you are. That's your zone. That's the close range. And then the more distant forest, that is going to be medium range to long range. It depends, again, on the situation. It changes. It adapts to whatever the situation for your combat is, like everything else in Star Trek Adventures, being narrative. So some things to keep in mind about ranges, communication and perception, things like that will be affected by the range. So anything beyond medium range would be very hard to communicate with and very hard to understand through simple shouting commands. Perception as well. The difficulty for perception tasks would increase by 1 for anything beyond close range because you can only see so far. Of course, advantages and different traits are going to affect this as they would anything else, but this is the general sense for perception and communication. Movement. Movement within medium range is considered a minor action. So anything beyond that is going to require a task, and that usually starts with base difficulty of 0. Also, cover is something to consider when you are establishing zones and terrain in your setting, in your battle, if you're a GM especially. Cover, when you have that is going to apply resistance or challenge dice that is going to add to your resistance. So you roll the cover dice, and whatever values come up, you add that to whatever other resistance your character has during the combat. So the key point here for cover is it is not static resistance. Cover value is the number of dice you roll. Any result you get from that, you will add to your resistance total for that attack if you are being damaged. So that's the main point to keep in mind. Some things with resistance, you roll dice. Cover is one of them. So let's go into the actions. For combat, there are going to be minor actions, and there's going to be the regular actions, your tasks that you are taking. Minor actions are things that do not count as a full task, and you get 1 free minor action every round of the combat. You can take more minor actions for a cost of 1 momentum each, and this is an immediate spend, which means you can generate threat instead of spending momentum for these additional minor actions. So let's go through quickly, and maybe not too much detail, but just go through the minor actions list. First, there's aim, which allows you to re-roll a single die. There's drawing an item, drawing your weapon. There's standing from prone or dropping prone. There's interacting with any items or your surroundings. There's movement within medium range, as I just mentioned with the terrain. And there's the prepare minor action. So prepare, you might have some things that you need to prepare before you could activate them, or some weapons that need prepare before they could be used. You would take it as a minor action, not a task. Those are the 6 main minor actions that will occur in combat. So going into the actual full actions, the tasks that you would take. Every character gets 1 task per round in combat, but they may take an additional one by different means. However, they may not do more than 2 tasks in a single round. That is the upper limit. No matter what, 2 is the maximum, but they all are guaranteed 1 task per round. Some things that might give a different task may be the direct task that we are going to talk about soon, or spending momentum to retain initiative. So you might take an immediate second action immediately from that. If you're taking a second action by paying 2 momentum to act again, that's only after you do a successful task. You could spend 2 momentum, take a second action, but the difficulty increases by 1 for doing more in such a short span of time. So let's look at the tasks. So you have the assist task, and that's where instead of doing your own task as a lead, you are assisting another player. And again, as we talked about in previous videos, assist, you are rolling 1 die while the lead is rolling the 2 or more dice. And as this counts as your task, assisting is your 1 action that you will get, your 1 task that you are allowed per turn. You could create an advantage, and this is typically a base 2 difficulty task to establish an advantage for the scene. You could do the direct task, where in this one, in a combat, only 1 character on each side of the combat is in the position of power, of leadership. Doesn't have to be a commanding character, just whatever the situation calls for. 1 character is in the position to be the leader, and they could call for a direct task. And instead of them taking their action, they nominate another ally to take an immediate task, and then they assist that ally by using their skill as the leader. So they tell the ally, you do this, and then they roll the assist for the ally. So it's giving another player a turn on your turn, basically. And again, that's where you could get a player acting twice in 1 action by using the direct task on somebody who's already acted in the round. So it can only be done once per combat, 1 time per combat, and you cannot have a player go over 2 tasks. So as I said, that's the hard limit. If someone has already acted twice and you want them to act again, direct will not help. 2 is the upper limit. Next task is guard, where you will protect yourself. You take a guarded stance. Base difficulty is 0, and it raises the difficulty to attack you by 1 until the next turn. You can also use guard to defend an ally instead of yourself. You may also pass. Instead of taking action, you could sit out the round, pass, do nothing. You could do a ready action. And ready is a little tricky, but it's pretty common in other role-playing games. You choose another action that you will take as a reaction to any sort of trigger that you define. It allows you to interrupt the action to act whenever this triggering event occurs. So for example, if you say that you want to activate this barrier when the Jem'Hadar soldiers cross a certain line, you are not acting then and programming the computer to activate the barrier. You're waiting. You're basically holding off your turn until the Jem'Hadar cross whatever that imaginary line is that you establish. Now, important points. If the triggering event does not occur, you lose your task. You spent the entire round waiting for that triggering event and it didn't happen. You do not get to act at the end of the round. It was just wasted. It just didn't happen. And the other important point is minor actions may still be done on your turn. So if you, for the same example, if you need to cross the room to get to where those controls are, you could say on your turn, I'm using a minor action to move to the controls, but I'm doing a ready task. I'm going to wait for them to cross that line, and then I'm going to activate the barrier and split the Jem'Hadar up into 2 groups. So those are the 2 big points to keep in mind about the ready task. It's putting your action off until a trigger that you define. After that, what do we have here? You have the recover task. This is good when you are taking some stress, you're getting winded, you're getting injured. It allows you to catch your breath and get back into the action. It's a fitness plus command base difficulty of 2 or 1 if you are in cover. If you succeed, you can regain the ability to avoid injury, which we will discuss in a little bit. And you can remove 2 stress that's been inflicted on you per each point of momentum that you spend. Until your next turn, each effect rolled on any cover dice you're rolling adds 1 resistance. So not only do you get to get some stress back and make yourself a little more in fighting shape by basically catching your breath, it also grants you a little bit of bonus to your cover because you're being extra defensive as you're recovering your strength. It's a pretty good ability. Next we have Sprint. Sprint is fitness and security with a base difficulty of 0. You can move to any point within medium range in this task, and you can spend 1 point of momentum for each additional zone you want to cover in this sprint. And of course, the difficulty is going to be affected by terrain, and it can only be used once per round. Some of you might be thinking, like, if movement is a minor action and I can move within medium range, Sprint also allows me to move within medium range, but that's my task. Why would I do the task when I have the minor action? Well, first of all, you can't do them both at the same time. You can't do a move minor action and the sprint action in the same round. But there might be other reasons why you just cannot afford to do the minor action. Maybe you have multiple minor actions you need to pay at once. So it would be better for you to just do the action, run to where you want to go, and then use a minor action for interact or something else of that nature. Or, of course, this is the one that's going to allow you to go beyond medium. So that's more or less why this task would be used over the movement minor action. And there is First Aid, which is stabilizing an injured character who is within reach of you. So a character that maybe has a lethal injury and they're dying, this would be daring plus medicine, base difficulty of 1, to successfully stabilize that character, and they will not die when the round is over, or when the scene is over, I should say. You can also spend 2 momentum after a successful first aid roll to bring that injured character back into the fight, and it would give them the same status, the same effect as ignoring injury with a determination spend. Ignoring injury I will be covering in a few moments, so please wait for that. Aside from that, you could basically do any other task available to you in the game. These are just the main ones for combat, but the biggest one, of course, is actually making an attack. So let's go into the details of that. Attacking is actually very simple, very straightforward, but there's a lot of small details and nuances that I think need to be covered. So let's jump into all of that right now. So attacks. First of all, step 1, you are going to choose the weapon that you are using and deciding whether you are making the attack lethal or non-lethal. After that, you will attempt the task. So attempting the task, if it's a melee attack, it's going to be daring plus security, base difficulty of 1, and it's an opposed roll. The enemy that you are fighting with in melee range is going to oppose it with their own daring plus security, also base difficulty of 1. The winner of this opposed roll will inflict stress on the loser, which means that if you fail the roll, you might be taking some stress damage because of that, because it's an opposed roll. So keep that in mind. If it's a ranged attack, however, that is going to use control plus security with a base difficulty of 2, of course, plus 1 if the enemy is within reach, like melee range. And the complication range will be plus 1 if there are other creatures or entities within reach of the target you are trying to hit. Complication rolled might mean you hit that bystander or that other creature instead of the target you were intending to hit. So, choose a weapon, choose lethal, non-lethal. You make your task roll. If you succeed, you inflict stress. So how that happens is each weapon has a damage rating of challenge dice. You roll that number of challenge dice plus your security discipline score. That total of dice you roll all together, and you see how many hits you get on all those dice total. You add that up, and then you check the target's resistance. The target would roll any cover dice, add it to any resistance they have. You subtract the resistance from the rolled stress. Anything left over is stress inflicted onto the target that is hit. After that's done, you'll check if any injuries were sustained, and then you go through the process of determining what kind of injuries, so on and so forth, and then the rounds repeat. Next player takes their action, next character takes the action, so on and so forth. So let's take a little more detail at the finer points, but again, before we do that, in quick review, choose a weapon, choose the type of attack, whether it's range, melee, make your roll. If you're successful, roll the challenge dice. It's listed for the weapon, plus your value of security. All those dice, you see what you get total. You subtract any resistance, apply the stress, and then you move on. There you go. So detail. First, melee. Melee combat. Here's just a little sidebar here. If you do melee combat, you do have more options than just fisticuffs of punching or trying to hit someone with a club. If you are successful in melee attacks, you could do disengage, where you are moving out of the reach of the opponent, trying to get some space between them. So you don't have to keep fighting. You could use your successful melee attack to break away from the person you are fighting with. You could instead grapple. So this would place a grapple complication on the opponent, where you lock them into a grappling lock. This prevents them from doing any action aside from trying to break free of your grapple or fighting back, but they get +1 difficulty against you because you have the lock on them. And another option, if you're successful with your melee attack, is to shove your opponent. If you shove the opponent, you force them out of your reach into close range, sort of the opposite of you disengaging, but you will still roll your challenge dice. You will still roll your challenge dice, not to inflict stress, but to see if you roll any knockdowns. So if any effect comes up, that counts as a knockdown. You knock the opposing character prone. So they take the prone position. So those are just some of the little details you could do with melee combat. And of course, you could work your own styles in. Other source books have things for different types of martial arts and different types of close range combat. So there are ways to elaborate on melee combat as well. Now, with all the simple, that's the basics. That's basically all attacking is. Very simple, very easy, very direct, just like that. Now going into the finer points. Let's say you did your roll. You inflicted damage, you inflicted stress. What is stress and injury? So taking a look, all characters have a stress track equal to their fitness and their security. Any stress that you incur starts to fill up that stress track. If you get 5 or more stress at one time, or your entire stress track is filled up to the maximum, you will be injured, or you may be injured. 9 times out of 10, you'll be injured. It counts as an injury. Attacks as well as hazards have stress ratings. So stress rating is the number of challenge dice that's rolled. The results are what inflict the stress on you. So it's not just attacks, it's hazards as well. Fire, falling, explosions, poisons, things like that, inflict stress against you. Resistance can be static or it can be circumstantial. So static might be something like armor, which provides a constant bonus. So maybe you have armor of resistance 1. You do not roll a challenge dice for that. That's an automatic 1 resistance to subtract any stress coming towards you. But cover, as we talked about before, that's more circumstantial. That's when you are rolling challenge dice for. Any results there will be added to static resistance. Total resistance is subtracted from the stress. So when you're injured, or let's go back and say how to get injured, because again, it's very much like extended task. 5 or more damage at once, 5 or more stress at once will trigger an injury. Just like extended task, 5 or more work at once triggers a breakthrough. That's 5 or more. If it's 10, that is not 2 injuries. 5 or more. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that just triggers 1 injury by that value. So 5 or more will score an injury. Another way is, as I mentioned, your stress track is completely filled up. Once your final stress is earned, that triggers an injury. And again, similar to extended task, if the stress track is already filled up and any stress comes in after that point, that will trigger an injury. So, for example, if any 2 of those conditions are met at the same time, it will trigger 2 injuries. And they are earned, they resolve 1 at a time. And that will be important. I'll explain that in a moment. So let's just take a look at it. So the first way, 5 or more stress gets earned and it fills up your track at the same time. So let's say I only had 3 points of stress left, but I get 6 stress on me. That's 1, 2, 3. It's filled up. I get an injury. And that was 6 points of stress. It's over 5. That's injury number 2. So that's 2 injuries at once. If the stress track was already filled up, any amount of stress coming in is going to cause an injury. So I'm already at maximum stress. 6 points of stress come in. I get an injury because I'm already maxed out and more stress is coming in. But that is also 5 or more stress. So that's a second injury. So again, 2 injuries coming at the same time. So you have to be very careful with that. You could get multiple injuries at one time. Same way that you could get multiple breakthroughs in extended tasks. When you're injured, an important point in this game is when you take any injury, your character is incapacitated. They are basically out of the fight. They're knocked down. They're unconscious. Whatever it is, any injury, a single injury, they are out. So if you take an injury, you are out for the remainder of the scene unless something brings you back in. Think of it just like in Star Trek when you see them firing phasers. Phaser beam hits a character, they're dropped instantly. Picture it like that, okay? That's being taken out by a single injury. Now, as I said, you could choose to make a non-lethal attack or a lethal attack, and they work a little bit differently. So if you are injured by a non-lethal attack, your character will fully recover at the end of the scene. So for the next scene, they will be back good as new. Things get a little bit worse when it's a lethal attack. So a character injured by a lethal attack will die at the end of the scene unless they are stabilized with a first aid task. After the character is stabilized, the injury is still there. They're not healed of the injury, they're just stabilized. So they still may no longer take any minor actions or perform any tasks for the remainder of the scene. They are still out, they are still incapacitated. Injured characters, however, have a little bit of I don't know if a bonus, but there's a benefit. They may not be freely targeted again in the combat unless the side either pays or generates a point of threat. So when you're injured, you're kind of safe. So unless they're actively trying to murder you or you're actively trying to kill the other side, you're generally safe. But if you do try, you have to spend threat or generate threat in order to make that attack. The next part is one of the most important parts about injuries, especially lethal injuries, and how your character can die. So the important point, which I've heard a lot of people make or get incorrectly and make many mistakes before, so please pay attention to this part here. A non-lethal injury will become a lethal injury if they are injured a second time. So if I've already taken a non-lethal injury and I'm incapacitated, but for some reason something causes a second injury on me, that second injury instead changes my non-lethal injury to a lethal injury. That means my character will die at the end of the round unless I am stabilized. The next point is, if the injury that you have is a lethal injury and another injury comes in on top of that, your character is killed instantly. So pay attention to that. Non-lethal injury, second injury comes in, changes to lethal. Already lethal injury, another injury comes in, your character dies. Could be disintegrated, could be whatever the situation calls for. That's the death of your character. Now what happens is, and I mentioned before, when you take multiple injuries at one time, you take them consecutively. So you might get 5 or more points of stress inflicted and you fill up your track. That's 2 injuries right there. If it's a non-lethal attack, that's still going to become a lethal injury because it scored 2 injuries on you at once. First one is non-lethal, you're incapacitated. Second one changes that to lethal, you are incapacitated and dying. If you are injured after you already have a lethal injury applied to you, that will kill your character. That's the key point. That's the important point. It's difficult to die in Star Trek Adventures for the most part because, and it should be, as you watch Star Trek TV series, and Star Trek Adventures is trying to replicate that. Characters, they get taken out, they get incapacitated, but they are back to fight. They are only taken out of the battle. You shouldn't be actively trying to destroy your characters, your player characters, trying to kill them. Starfleet should not be trying to kill their targets they're fighting if they can avoid it. Klingons, different story, but at the same time, it should be difficult in a non-lethal combat for your character to die, but it's not impossible. So moving on. Now there are ways to keep fighting to stay into the battle once you are injured. Generally, injury incapacitates you, you're out, but there are 2 main ways to keep going. First is called avoiding injury, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier. You spend 2 momentum. It's an immediate spend, so you can use threat for it as well, and you will avoid the effects of being injured. Now, any stress that is incurred and any other effects that might happen from that injury still apply, but you don't get injured. So imagine, like you see in some episodes, somebody takes maybe a phaser blast to the shoulder. There's some scorching, there's grunting, they fall to the ground, they're clutching themselves, but they're still going. It's similar to that. You take all the stress damage and all the effects, complications that arrive from that hit, but you are not considered injured. You're not on the ground. And this is called avoiding injury. You can only do it 1 time per scene unless you do a successful recover task that we've talked about earlier. Now, the second way is called ignoring injury. It's very different from avoiding injury. It's ignoring the injury. So just like the word means, you are getting injured, but you're ignoring it. So you're taking the stress, you're taking the damage, you are taking on the injured quality. You are injured, lethal, non-lethal, whatever it is, you are injured, but you're ignoring it and you're pushing onward. This costs 1 point of determination to ignore an injury. You will ignore the effects of the injury for the remainder of the scene, and unlike other determination uses, you don't need to tie it to a value. You could just spend the point if you have it and keep going. Now, the big points to keep in mind about ignoring injury is you are still injured. You didn't avoid it, you are injured. And you're giving up the protection of being incapacitated. So the enemy can still target you freely. It doesn't cost extra threat. You could be hit again. You can be injured again. And that could kill you. So you're giving up the safety of being knocked out, knocked unconscious to keep fighting. Imagine a Klingon takes a very massive stab to the gut from a bat'leth. And instead of dropping down, he's a strong warrior. He's a proud warrior. He's going to keep fighting even though he's on the brink of death. That's what ignoring an injury is. Once the scene ends, all the effects of being injured will return. So if it's a lethal injury, that character is going to die unless they are immediately stabilized by a first aid roll. And now, because they ignored the injury, the difficulty is increasing by 1. So it's a great heroic way to keep pushing through in a tough battle, but it's very risky. So avoiding injury and ignoring injury, 2 ways to keep going once you are injured in battle, to keep you pushing until maybe death or maybe a second injury comes along, takes you out. So those are the main points of dealing with stress and injuries. So let's say your character is injured, you need to be healed. Healing injuries and healing complications would happen almost certainly after the battle. So after combat is done, to heal the injury, because even stabilizing a lethal wound isn't removing the injury, it's just keeping them alive. To heal the injury, it's a daring and medical base difficulty of 1 to stabilize. However, treating the injury is a control and medicine base difficulty of 3. So it's a lot more difficult. But of course, as with everything, traits, advantages, complications will affect this difficulty level. It's a lot more difficult to heal this injury, to treat this injury on the field of battle than it would be taking the character to a well-stocked sickbay on a starship. So something like that will lower this base difficulty down. But remember, the base is 3, and you just keep adding any complications, advantages, traits, whatever that will affect it to make it go up or down based on that. But it's still a lot trickier. Treating the injury successfully removes the injury, but there might still be lingering complications that were received via getting injured. To remove the complications, this is also control medicine with a difficulty of 2, base difficulty of 2, to remove 1 complication, and you may spend 2 points of momentum for each additional complication you would like to remove that was caused by that injury. So that's how the medical staff will be treating the wounds after the fight's over. Now, the last part I'm going to talk about here very quickly. Not going to go into too much detail because this is stuff that you'll reference depending on what your character is using and when you're in the game. But just to know what it is, weapons and effects. So a weapon, of course, will have a whole bunch of stats listed for it. You'll have the type of weapon, whether it's melee, whether it's range. You'll have the stress rating, which is the number of challenge dice you roll, in addition to the number of challenge dice given to you by your security discipline score. Then the size of the weapon. If it's one-handed or two-handed, if you try using a two-handed weapon in one hand, it increases the difficulty by 1. And then any qualities that apply to this weapon, which are additional restrictions or additional benefits to using the weapon. Now, some weapons also have effects. Well, first of all, weapon effects, when you roll your challenge dice and an effect symbol comes up, that will trigger all of the effects listed for that weapon. So you don't spend each rolled effect. Just getting one triggers everything that is listed for the weapon. Some effects are area. Area will allow you to apply the effects of that weapon to additional targets that are in close range of your original target. And the number is 1 for each effect rolled. So if you roll 2 effects, you could apply the effects to 2 different targets next to the one you were attacking. And of course, the GM will determine whether that actually makes logical sense with the attack you're making. But that's what area allows you to do. Intense weapon effect increases the cost to avoid injury. As we talked about just a few moments ago, 2 momentum to avoid injury. An intense weapon, if you're injured by an intense weapon, it increases +1 per effect rolled. So if you roll 3 effects, that's 3 more momentum needed to avoid the injury. So that would be 5 to avoid injury. Knockdown. On this weapon, if you successfully hit, you knock down the target. They can avoid being knocked down by spending threat equal to the number of effects rolled. So 3 effects rolled, they have to spend 3 threat or generate 3 threat in order to stay on their feet. If not, they are knocked down. Piercing. Piercing has a value. So you can ignore whatever that value is in resistance for each effect rolled. So if you have piercing 1 and you roll 3 effects, you can remove 3 points of resistance from the target before applying the stress, which is good. If it's piercing 2 and you roll 3 effects, that's 6 points of resistance you're rolling. So it counts per effect rolled. Keep that in mind. And there's Vicious X. Vicious is, it adds extra stress equal to the Vicious rating per the number of effects rolled. If it's Vicious 1 and you roll 3 effects, that's +3 stress being inflicted. Vicious 2, 3 effects, 6 extra stress being inflicted. So it's a pretty scary ability to have on the weapon there. The last thing I want to talk about with weapons, again, qualities. I'm not going to go through all the qualities, but just a couple of the ones I want to point out. Some qualities such as accurate. Accurate goes hand in hand with the aiming minor action. If you aim, you can reroll additional d20s if the weapon is accurate. If it has charge, like phasers, standard Starfleet phasers have charge. This quality allows you to choose one effect from a list to apply to your attack. The effect could be the area effect, intense, piercing 2, or vicious 1. So you have to do a prepare minor action, but you apply one of those effects that you want to your attack roll. If it's listed as a deadly weapon, it means the attacks are going to be lethal. And if you want to use it in a non-lethal manner, it's going to increase the difficulty by 1. Likewise, if it's a non-lethal quality, all of the attacks are going to be non-lethal. But if you try to use it in a lethal manner, difficulty increases by 1. And there are many more. So check the book, check the weapon that you are using for any qualities, reference it. You'll need to know in the moment. You do not need to commit to memory right now. The last thing that applies to combat, but again, I'm not going to go into in this review, is combat momentum spends. There is a chart in the book that you could reference to know how you want to spend momentum in combat. But the majority of them I've already discussed as we went through the rules here already, and I discussed previously in an earlier lesson about momentum itself, so I don't need to repeat that here. And that is personal combat and social conflict. So I hope that cleared up any confusion you might have had about how to do just regular combat in the game. As I said, it's very similar to extended tasks, same exact mechanics. When we get into starships in the next lesson, you'll see starship combat is the same thing, same extended task mechanics, follows the same procedures. There are going to be a lot of similarities with personal combat and starship combat, but of course starships, you have a crew acting as one, so there are some differences which we will get into next time. So if you have any more questions, or as I said, if I left anything out, anything major, or if I skipped over something, which is highly likely, please leave a comment, let me know, and we will discuss it later on. But thank you, I hope this helped. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for our next lesson on starships. So as always, stay safe out there, my friends. Live long and prosper. Peace and long life. See ya.